prime example of the shallowness of Civil War historical storylines is the narrative endlessly repeated of the surrender of Harper's Ferry, which assigns blame for its happening to Colonel Dixon S. Miles of the regular Army. The reality, however, is that the blame belongs entirely to Brigadier General of Volunteers Julius White, a Republican politician from Chicago who Lincoln made a brigadier in June 1862. Prior to the war, Julius White made his money as the manager of the insurance operations of the Travelers Insurance Company in Illinois and Wisconsin. White invested his accumulating wealth in real estate, developing land in what is now Evanston, Illinois. During the 1850s, he became a prominent member of the emerging Republican Party, connected to the leaders of the party in Illinois, including Lincoln. In the spring of 1861, he organized a regiment he called the Fremont Rifles, which he offered to Illinois Governor Yates, who accepted it as the 37th Illinois Volunteer Regiment. The regiment joined the Union Army in Missouri and marched with it through the state, engaging in skirmishes. In March 1862, White commanded 2 regiments engaged on the first day of the Battle of Pea Ridge. The regiments, badly managed, sustained heavy casualties, during the course of which White claimed he sustained an injury to his leg. After the battle, White obtained a leave of absence and returned to Chicago, where he remained until June 1862, when, at Governor Yates' behest, Lincoln approved his commission as Brigadier General of Volunteers. Upon confirmation of his commission, White was ordered to Virginia to take command of Pius Brigade posted at Winchester. The brigade at that time was detached from the Army of Virginia being formed by John Pope. The brigade was composed of 3 regiments, which had been part of Fremont's army, engaged with Stonewall Jackson at Cross Keys in June 1862, and also a regiment of raw recruits. The regiments were the 39th New York, commanded by DeTassey, which had been part of Blinker's division at the Battle of Bull Run and had went with the division to Fremont's army, participating in Fremont's operations in the valley during the spring of 1862. The 60th Ohio, commanded by Trimble, also operated with Fremont's army in its pursuit of Jackson in the spring of 1862, and it too was engaged at Cross Keys. The 32nd Ohio, commanded by Ford, mustered into service in September 1861 and operated in the valley with Fremont's army at Cross Keys. The 4th Regiment was the 9th Vermont, commanded by Standard. The 9th Vermont was composed of Dartmouth College boys. It had mustered into service in July 1862 and had experienced no action prior to its involvement with the surrender of Harper's Ferry. White commanded the brigade at Winchester during the summer of 1862, the soldiers of the regiment spending their time as guards of the town, on patrol in the countryside, and as laborers engaged in the completion of 3 forts about the town. In the last days of August, as Lee's army was maneuvering against Pope on the line of the Rappahannock, White telegraphed General-in-Chief Henry Halleck that Confederate infantry force was appearing in the valley from the south and from the direction of Front Royal. And on September 2, Halleck ordered White to spike the guns in place in the forts and withdraw his brigade to Harper's Ferry. On September 4, White arrived at the ferry and met Colonel Miles, who was the commander of the garrison posted at that place. The troops under Colonel Miles' command were several New York volunteer regiments, which had been at the ferry since mustering into service for 3 months in June. Miles had drilled the soldiers of these regiments on a daily basis since June, but now, at the beginning of September, their enlistments were expiring, and between September 4 and September 7, 3 of them would depart by train for New York. These were replaced by 3 raw New York regiments, which Major General John Wool, commander of the military department the ferry was assigned to, diverted as they arrived in Baltimore from New York on their way to Washington. The 4th Regiment, the 12th New York, was unable to leave the ferry because by the time his turn came to take the trains, Lee's army had crossed the Potomac and was occupying Frederick, Maryland. During September 5, Miles communicated with Wool, informing him of White's arrival and asking for instructions. Wool replied by ordering White to proceed to Martinsburg and take command of 2 regiments of raw recruits posted there. These were the 65th Illinois, commanded by Cameron, which had arrived in Martinsburg from Chicago in July, and the 125th New York, also composed of raw recruits commanded by Willard, that had arrived in Martinsburg from New York on September 2. White arrived at Martinsburg on September 6, just as a skirmish was concluding between the 12th Illinois Cavalry, commanded by Amos Voss, and elements of Ashby's cavalry. Upon the Confederate cavalry's withdrawal, White wired to Major General Wool on September 7, requesting he order Miles to reinforce the Martinsburg garrison. During the day of September 7th, a number of communications went back and forth between Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and White, between White and Wool, and between Miles and Wool and General-in-Chief Halleck. The substance of these communications can be summed up thusly. Informed of the cavalry skirmish at Martinsburg, Stanton wired Wool that he expected all posts within Wool's department to be held, and he wired directly to White that he expected there would be no surrendering of a post, and that, in his words, quote, every man would fight as if the life of the government depended upon him, unquote. Wool echoed Stanton's words, wiring to both Miles and White that there would be no running, that the post would be defended, in his words, quote, to the last extremity, unquote. And Halleck chimed in, wiring to Wool that the method of organizing in defense of the posts was Wool's sole responsibility, though Halleck thought it a good idea for Wool to consider ordering Miles to move his force to Elk's Ridge, a mountain spur on the north side of the Potomac in Maryland. Halleck also wired directly to Miles, telling him the government would give him full credit for the defense of the ferry. White, at Martinsburg, reacted to these communications on September 7 by wiring Wool, requesting he define what he meant by holding the post to the, quote, last extremity, unquote. Wool replied with the statement that if 20,000 enemy were approaching Martinsburg, White was free to fall back to the ferry. When White received this message, he reflected on his situation and wired a message directly to General-in-Chief Halleck requesting that he be relieved of command of the post at Martinsburg and be assigned a place with McClellan's army, then about to move from Rockville toward Frederick. Halleck replied, saying that since White had moved from Winchester, which was within the Department of Virginia, to the Ferry, which was within Wool's department, White was now under Wool's command and subject to his orders. Events now escalated in tempo. On September 7, Miles had reported to Halleck and Wool that the colonel of the 87th Ohio, which was posted at Point of Rocks, estimated that 30,000 enemy infantry had crossed the Potomac at Edwards Ferry. On September 10, Miles reported to Wool that his cavalry scouts had seen a column of enemy infantry marching through Boonesboro, which was estimated to be 15,000 strong. And on September 11th, White reported to Wool that this column was at Williamsport, crossing the Potomac. While the messages of September 7 appear to have passed eastward on the telegraph line between the Ferry and Washington, what messages were sent and received between the 7th and the 12th passed to Washington via telegram stations west of Martinsburg, then north to Harrisburg, and thence to Washington. After the 12th, no messages sent were received until after Lee's army had retreated from Sharpsburg. On September 12, White, reacting to the enemy infantry's approach, loaded a train with what military equipment it could carry and marched his column to Harper's Ferry, arriving there the evening of the 12th. White had now arrived at the decisive moment of his role in American history. He was, in fact, a brigadier general of volunteers, personally endorsed by President Lincoln for the commission as such. And as the consequence of the commission, he knew that according to the Articles of War, he outranked a colonel of the regular army. But instead of asserting his rank and taking command of the whole force now assembled at the Ferry, White tells us that he voluntarily placed the troops he brought from Martinsburg under Miles' command, because Miles showed him the telegram from Halleck, dated September the 7th, in which Halleck told Miles the government would give him full credit for the defense of the Ferry, White claiming that to him this meant the government expected Miles to remain in command of the defense. But White had in his own possession a telegram sent to him on September 7th by Edward Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, expressly stating to him that there was to be no surrendering of posts, that every man was expected to fight as if the life of the government depended upon him. Had he wanted to, therefore, there is no intelligent reason why White would not have asserted to Miles that Stanton's September 7 telegram to him trumped Halleck's September 7th telegram to Miles, and that whatever one might imply from Wool's silence in his communications regarding the matter of who was to command when the two officers came together at the Ferry, the text of Stanton's telegram plainly gave White the legitimate authority to assert his rank, assume command of the whole force, and make the decisions regarding its disposition. Plainly, undisputably, White shirked the responsibility. Instead, he used Miles, and to Miles' discredit, Miles allowed White to do it as a Beard, putting Miles in ostensible command to take the blame for the surrender White envisioned would occur at some point in the coming days as the enemy forces concentrated upon the ferry. Since the colonels of the 3 regiments with combat experience had personal connection with White, he could expect them to follow his guide, while the colonels of the regiments of raw recruits could be expected to follow the lead of the colonels of the experienced regiments. So it would be easy for White to leave Miles in ostensible command, making him responsible on paper for the outcome, while White induced the surrender to occur by the simple expedient of calling for a council of war to decide the question. And this is what, to White's shame, he did. At first light on September 15, the men, still in the ranks of A.P. Hill's regiments, were lying on the ground of the Murphy farm, about 400 yards from the Union line, which Miles had established along the Charleston Pike at the point it intersects Boulevard Heights. The river valley at that time was filled with morning fog. Confederate artillery batteries opened from the ridge of Loudon Heights, from the flatland on the east side of the Shenandoah River, and from the valley between Loudon Heights and Schoolhouse Ridge. The artillery fire throwing shells at the Union line and into the saddle behind the line in Camp Hill. To a thinking, experienced soldier such as Miles, as well as a neophyte like White, it was a serious question whether an attack by A.P. Hill's soldiers would actually develop. First, both White and Miles knew that a furious 3-day battle had occurred at Manassas just 10 days earlier, and that Jackson's divisions had borne the brunt of the struggle, being assailed with repetitive frontal attacks from Pope's corps, and consequently must have taken substantial casualties. Second, given Jackson's movement from Manassas to Frederick almost immediately after the battle, the likelihood was not great that his command had received fresh replacements for his battle losses. Third, there were the reports Miles and White had received earlier that the strength of Jackson's column marching from Frederick for Martinsburg was numbered but 15,000, and the Union force defending the ferry was numbered at 11,000. The relative strength of the opposing forces, therefore, seemed to give the defense the advantage. Fourth, the terrain Hill's men had to traverse in their attack favored the defense. Hill's men could not approach the apex of the Union defensive line directly because a deep wooded ravine gouged the earth immediately in front of it. As a consequence of this feature of ground, Hill's men had to launch their attack to the right of the ravine on the slope of farmland in front of the pike, and it was uphill all the way to the contact point. Finally, though the Confederate artillery fire was galling and caused havoc in the rear area behind the Union defensive line, the Confederate guns would have to cease firing once Hill's men rose from the ground and began running up the open slope of the hill toward the Union line, at which point The Union batteries anchoring the line would open with canister, blasting gaps in the Confederate mass running toward it. With these tactical realities in mind, thinking soldiers would surely consider, too, the strategic situation that ought to have been reasonably clear to White and Miles. White and Miles certainly heard the artillery booming on the north side of the Potomac on September 14. From this, they must have assumed a battle was being fought between McClellan's army and Lee's at a gap in the Blue Ridge, probably between Boonesboro and Middletown, and that therefore McClellan's army might the morning of the 15th be moving southward toward the Potomac, and that Lee's army might also be moving toward the Potomac. Under such circumstances, might Jackson not attack their position? Might he decide not to risk getting entangled in a battle with their force and suddenly find them being reinforced by McClellan? Even if the Confederate attack materialized, the tactical factors certainly suggested that if the Union troops held their ground and did not run, there was a reasonable degree of certainty that the first attack might be repulsed, and that it would take time for the enemy to reform and attack again, and that relief might arrive before the Union force was overwhelmed. And if it didn't, the Union force, having held to the point the enemy was breaking in, then would come surrender. In the actual event, the analysis, the facts suggest, was in order for White and Miles to evaluate, is borne out by the fact that almost 5 hours passed from first light to the point the white flag was exhibited without Hill's men rising from the ground of the Murphy farm and running forward into the Union's canister fire. As each hour passed, with no attack materializing, soldiers in White's and Miles' shoes would be thinking, given the fact that everyone knew time was of the essence for the Confederates, the probabilities were increasing that the attack would not come. And even if it did, the passing of each hour meant it more likely relief was getting closer. Notwithstanding all of this, ignoring his self-serving, unsubstantiated statements later, White told Miles he was calling a council of war of his colonels to consider the question of surrender. It appears from the record that of the 11 colonels in command of regiments at the Ferry, only DeTassey, commanding the 39th Illinois, and Trimble, commanding the 32nd Ohio, were present, though later several other colonels claimed they too were present. However, it was all of the colonels, in subsequent statements given, do not deny that there was unanimous consent among them that they surrender, at which point White assumed the role of commissioner to effectuate the terms of the surrender announced by the showing of a white flag. Moments after the white flag was displayed, a Confederate shell struck Miles, and he was killed. White arrived at Annapolis as a paroled prisoner of war on September 20. On September 23, at the order of Stanton, Wool arrested White and sent him to Washington, where he remained until released from arrest at the conclusion of the military commission assembled to determine who was to blame for the surrender. The commission assigned the blame to Miles, asserting that his decisions regarding the defense of the ferry were imbecilic, and it commended White for his, quote, decided capacity and courage, unquote. In November 1862, White obtained a leave of absence on the ground he was ill and returned to Chicago. In January 1863, he reported himself for duty and was eventually assigned in June 1863 to Kentucky, where he took command of a brigade attached to the newly formed 23rd Corps, commanded by Burnside. In November 1863, White commanded a division, which acted as Burnside's rear guard, as Burnside retreated from Longstreet's crossing of the Tennessee River at Huff's Ferry through the Norths and Campbell Station to Knoxville. In December 1863, when Burnside left Knoxville for Cincinnati, White obtained a leave of absence on the ground of sickness and returned again to Chicago. 4 months later, in April 1864, reporting for duty, White was assigned mustering officer at Springfield, Illinois, for new regiments formed for service in the field, a post he held until July 1864, when he was assigned in the Ninth Corps, then under Burnside's command at Petersburg. White arrived at Petersburg on July 30, the night before the mine was to explode in the Confederate lines. For 24 hours or so, White acted in place of Park as Burnside's chief of staff when Little left the Army after the failure at the crater. In August 1864, White's division was advanced in support of the 5th Corps attack on the Weldon Railroad, but the Confederates, in counterattacking, broke the connection between his division and the 5th Corps, causing substantial casualties. On November 19, 1864, White resigned his commission on the ground he was seriously ill and returned for the final time to Chicago. In January 1865, White wrote to Stanton asking that he be brevetted a major general of volunteers for his service, that is, promoted for bravery in battle, but without the pay or privileges associated with the rank. Given what the record shows, Stanton was not receptive to White's request. As the record shows, he did not respond. In October 1865, some 11 months later, Burnside, at White's behest, wrote Stanton, characterizing White as having proved to be an efficient soldier, and he recommended White be brevetted Major General. Still, Stanton did not respond. Some 6 months later, in June 1866, Illinois Governor Yates wrote Stanton asking that White be brevetted Major General. Still no response from Stanton. Then, in November 1866, Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas informed White the brevet was approved, and White went to his grave in 1890 proclaiming on the stone he was a Major General, leaving unstated that the rank was merely an honor, not a commission. Meanwhile, laying in obscurity and disgrace were the remains of Colonel Dixon S. Miles in a churchyard far removed from the Evanston cemetery in which White's lay. The engraver of the inscription on White's gravestone appears to have been given the list of White's engagements during the war, with Martinsburg out of order. White's presence at Harper's Ferry is not mentioned.